little remedial to just start the first question with the title of the book, but hegemony. In the context of what you're talking about, what does that mean?
Well, so hegemony is a term which comes from the writings of the Italian communist Antonio Gramsci. I mean, it's a word that has some other meanings in other contexts, but in the tradition of radical political theory, really it translates an Italian word, which is more usually translated as leadership. So basically that's what it means. And what it refers to is the ability of relatively small groups in a society to exercise a kind of leadership over the rest of the society. So the way we like to explain this is to say that hegemony is basically the capacity to determine the general direction of travel for a society or a group or indeed for the whole planet. So that's basically what we mean by it.
All right. And fair enough. And so, Alex, as you guys write, this, it's so much of like what we talk about on this program, much of this, hegemony begins, or at least those who are in a position of having hegemony over the direction of society starts in the 70s, as we enter into an era of financialization, and also almost simultaneously the development of new technology that both enhances the ability for financialization and then also becomes sort of platforms in and of itself. Give us a little bit of that history.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really kind of nice way of introducing it. I mean, a lot of the time, neither of those things is really mentioned when you think about the 1970s. Certainly a lot of academics and kind of leftist commentators would rather talk about neoliberalism, right? So they'd be talking about maybe about Thatcher Reagan, maybe about the Montpeleran Society and Friedrich von Hayek and Friedman and all of that. And certainly all of that is very important. The slightly less remarked upon component of their ability to implement neoliberalism, you know, first of all in the kind of anglophone world and then later on across Europe and then the rest of the world. A lot of what enabled them to do that was exactly the fact that, you know, financialization could occur, that, you know, technology allowed things like, you know, disaggregation of production systems. So, you know, you could crush your working class within America or the UK because much of your production was going to be happening in Southeast Asia. And all of this involves the emergence of kind of computerization, later the internet, and the liberalization of finance. And all of these things kind of happen together and are kind of, they're all involved in this kind of process. And very much today when we look around, you know, who is it who's managed to get what they want? You know, which groups in society have managed to kind of achieve their aims best of all? And it wasn't the kind of Thatcher Reagan conservatives, because, you know, they'd look at sort of much of modern society and be pretty aghast at the kind of the lack of social conservatism. And instead, the people who've really got what they want are the people who work in, you know, big finance and big tech. They've achieved most of what they want. If you look around us,
I want to examine that last point a little bit too, because I think, you know, it feels to me like part of Thatcher and Reagan's agenda was also this sort of like neoliberal economics. I think they also, at least in Reagan's case, was very conscious of, like, you know, who's going to be the wind under his sails, as it were. But just for the sake of folks who don't fully understand the concept of financialization, give us a sense of like what the difference is between what financialization means in terms of like when we're talking about, we've moved from something where, you know, we're just talking about companies making money via producing things and putting it out there, providing services to what when we talk about financialization?
Yeah, you're talking about a shift from an economy in which indeed, as you say, in which the bottom line of companies is mainly a function of how well they produce stuff and get it out to people who want to buy it, to one in which that's relatively secondary. And the thing that really determines the profitability and the share price of companies is just their ability to engage in these kind of speculations on the rising prices of assets, the rising prices of shares, and above all on debt, actually. I mean, the whole economy, I mean, the big shift towards a kind of financialized economy from the 70s onwards is a shift to an economy that is based on debt. And a shift towards an economy where how rich you are, either as a corporation, depends on how much debt you can sell to people and to other, including other corporations, but also people's standard of living as consumers increasingly depends on access to cheap credit, on access to, rather than their actual real wages. Comparing real wages at different historical moments is notoriously quite difficult, but on some measures, real wages, and certainly wages as a share of the overall economy, are stagnating really from the early 70s onwards, pretty much indefinitely, with some little blips subsequently. And so people are only able to enjoy this increase in their standard of living, the cheap vacations, the big TVs, the things that have kind of made life relatively tolerable for people over the past few decades. They've only been able to experience those things through access to consumer credit, through access to various kinds of debt. And of course, to come back to your earlier point, one of the things that often isn't really remarked upon is that all of this is dependent upon the rolling out of communications technologies. It's dependent on credit cards. It's dependent on the computerization of the stock market and the banks in the 1980s. It's really physically dependent on all of those processes. And then eventually you get into a situation like the one we're in now, where really, I mean, even things like education are kind of seen as sites of speculative investment. They're seen as things which corporations want to make money from, but they don't even want to make money really from delivering high quality services, which is the headline claim of neoliberalism and advocates for school reform and charter schools and things like this. Really what they want to do is they want to get kind of monopoly control of delivering services in certain areas, and then they want people to invest. They want their investors to give them money on the basis of the assumption that that's going to deliver increased profitability at some time in the future. So financialization, to some extent, leads to this situation in which the entire economy is driven by speculation on the future and on a kind of permanent set of bets on the permanent inflation of asset prices, share prices, property prices, land prices, and even stuff like Bitcoin. So that is what is involved. I mean, that is what we mean by financialization. Of course, also at the level of kind of political sociology, if you like. It's also about the question of, well, who are the most powerful sections of the capitalist class? I mean, from a Marxian perspective, you can say that going right back to the 19th century, there's often a tension within capitalism, within the capitalist class, between, on the one hand, industrial capital, manufacturers, the people who actually make stuff, and on the other hand, finance capital, the banks, the people who lend them the money to make stuff. And they have convergent interests on a certain time scale and in certain ways, but often within a short to medium term, they have quite different interests. And what's really distinctive about the American economy in the post-war period is that the manufacturing capital, industrial capital, is really in a privileged position. You've got government, you've got unions, you've got a whole kind of regime which is designed to protect their interests. And finance capital has been put in a box. There's all these rules about how much speculation they're allowed to engage in, how much currency speculation, how much lending they're allowed to do, who they're allowed to lend money to. And one of the big objectives of the whole neoliberal project of the 70s, 80s and onwards is to, as David Harvey said years ago, is to restore the power of finance capital, to get those people, to liberate it, to get those people out of the box. And that's a really big part of what happens over that period, I think.
And in many respects, I mean, it seems that during that period, the conflict between the sort of the industrialists and the finance capitalists seems to also break down on some level, in the sense that once we get into an era in this country anywheres where capital is taxed at a much lower rate, capital gains is taxed at a much lower rate than working for a living, the incentive structure for CEOs and board of directors changes dramatically from I am judged exclusively on the basis of what I produce and how I set up a 5-year plan for this manufacturing outfit and this and that, to all of a sudden like, well, wait a second, I'm actually making my money on the stock price, which is
shareholder value, baby.
Yeah, exactly. And then all of a sudden it becomes like, well, I can juice the stock price by just creating a delta between our revenue and our costs. And I don't have to necessarily raise the revenue. I could lower the cost, and that may cut into the value of this company 5 or 10 years down the road, but my stocks vest 4 years from now. And so I don't care. I mean, that's a little bit, I think, crass and obvious, but that seems to be the dynamic. And suddenly these companies themselves, all the leadership of them, perceive themselves as financialized entities in and of themselves.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Yeah.
All right.
And the interesting,
go ahead,
the interesting thing is just what happens beyond the just corporations when you're thinking about financialization. It's not just your corporate executives who are thinking of themselves as financialized entities. It's a lot of ordinary people as well, in a certain sense.
Yeah, you have these guys. These guys are the guys with the most high-paying jobs in the world. They're rolling out their schemes, recruiting people from the Ivy League. So you go through high school and college knowing if you want to join these masters of the universe, you've got to think like that too. You've got to think like one of these short-term, aggressively profit-seeking, speculative finance capitalists. Then it goes further. Politics, because that's where all the money is. So that's where, and they start rolling out policies which start saying even public servants have to think the same way. Even if you're managing a school, for reasons we've already alluded to, you have to think the same way. You end up in a world where like teenagers are watching TikTok videos telling them how they have to be hustlers, and it's all basically the same kind of logic of thinking which proceeds from that. And that's what we mean by hegemony. That's the way in which these particular powerful forces are able to disseminate a kind of particular way of thinking about the world, a whole kind of pattern of thinking about the world, if you like, what Gramsci calls a common sense. And I think that's a really good example of how a particular kind of common sense gets sort of disseminated. And then you end up in a situation where everybody living in a society like the ones we live in today, even if they hate all that stuff, they kind of know that's the rules of the game. They kind of know that those are the rules you have to play by, even if you hate it.